Yeah, I think you are live.
Shruti. Right.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shruti, and I'm a research assistant at the Institute of Chinese Studies. On behalf of the Institute, I welcome you all to this edition of Wednesday seminar. Today, we will be holding a discussion on the book, The Fractured Himalayas, India, Tibet, China, 1949 to 1962, which is a history of the diplomacy between India and China during a crucial period of their early nationhood. Joining us is the author, Ambassador Nirupama Rao. In her long and illustrious career, she has been India's Foreign Secretary from 2009 to 2011 and Ambassador to China and the US, among others. In retirement, she has taught at various universities, including Brown University, Columbia University, etc. Mr. Anant Krishnan will be the discussing. Mr. Krishnan is the China correspondent for The Hindu. He has authored a book titled India's China Challenge and co-authored The Comrades and the Mullahs, China, Afghanistan, and the New Asian Geopolitics. Chairing the session is ICS Director, Ambassador Ashok Pandya. A very warm welcome to all our guests. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to lay down the housekeeping rules. All members in the audience are to remain muted for the duration of the presentations. Questions can be raised in the chat box anytime during the event or using the raise hand option during the Q&A. Kindly unmute only when called upon by the chair to do so. Thank you. Over to the chair now.
Thank you, Shruti. Thank you for that introduction. Let me also welcome all of you to this edition of the ICS Wednesday seminar. As Shruti mentioned, today we have with us a distinguished diplomat scholar, Ambassador Nirupama Rao, and we'll be discussing her much acclaimed new book, The Fractured Himalaya, India, Tibet, China, 1949-1962. Ambassador Rao is one of our most distinguished diplomats. I had the pleasure of working with Nirupama in different capacities over the years. As you're aware, she has held several key diplomatic assignments, but one aspect of her career I would like to highlight, and that is her strong interest in and deep expertise on India-China relations, and more specifically, India-China boundary question. Her profound understanding of the history and nuances of India-China relations and the border issue is amply reflected in this book. But above all, it's a scholarly work based on prodigious research of primary and secondary material, of archives which are now accessible to scholars. Nirupama's book promises to be an authoritative text on intricate interactions involving India, Tibet, and China during the critical period leading up to the 1962 border conflict, which continues to resonate strongly in our dealings with China. The Fractured Himalaya looks at several inflection points during the period 1949-1962, when certain fateful decisions were taken in the diplomatic engagement between India and China, which impacted the trajectory of bilateral relations and how the two countries perceive each other even today. It's a deeply researched book which has the singular merit of being lucid and accessible to its readers at the same time. Nirupama brings out the context in which certain decisions were taken that turned out to be flawed. One such inflection point was to recognize Tibet as a part of China in undue haste after the PLA occupied it in 1950, and the subsequent decision to conclude an agreement with China in 1954 on trade and intercourse with the Tibet region of China without raising the boundary question or getting confirmation of our alignment from the Chinese side. These were some of the decisions which altered the course of India-China relations. Nirupama spells out in detail complexities of the issues involved, how different views were offered, and why certain decisions were taken. She is candid and objective in analysis without being harshly judgmental. This is particularly true when she looks at the formulation of India's China policy in the 1950s and early 1960s. It's fashionable now to put all the blame on Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, our first Prime Minister, for the failures of our China policy, several acts of omission and commission. The book frankly notes that there were no doubt strategic errors in the higher direction of leadership, which proved costly to India. But it also examines in detail the context in which those decisions were taken by Nehru and the role of other actors and institutions who were also found to be seriously lacking. As the title of the book suggests, Tibet was a key factor in the dealings between India and China. Tibet had its own agency and maintained its autonomous international personality for decades prior to its subjugation by China in the early 1950s. The centrality of Tibet is clearly brought out in Ambassador Nirupama Rao's book. A major problem in undertaking research on this period is that while a significant portion of Indian archives is now available to scholars, access to the corresponding archival resources on the Chinese side is very limited because of the decision of the Chinese government to close archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing after a brief period of limited opening to scholars from 2007 to 2012. Despite this constraint, Nirupama's book sheds new light on the motives and drivers in the decision-making on the Chinese side as well, apart from looking at the Indian angle in much greater detail. This afternoon, Nirupama will talk about her book for about 20 minutes. We'll thereafter have comments from Anand Krishnan, China correspondent, The Hindu. I propose to have a short conversation with Nirupama and then open the floor for discussion. As Shruti mentioned, please ask your questions or offer your comments in the chat box. You may also use the raise hand option. May I now request Ambassador Nirupama Rao to make her opening remarks. Over to you, Nirupama.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Kanta, Ashok. Good afternoon to everybody present here today. Good afternoon, Anand. Thank you for joining for this discussion. I'm really looking forward to the interaction this afternoon. I thank the Institute of Chinese Studies particularly for making it possible to have this discussion on my book. And Ashok, your remarks today have covered everything I basically wanted to say about the book. Thank you so much. You seem to have really brought out the various aspects and highlighted them in order to promote a better understanding of this study. I'll speak briefly on the book and my writing of it. I thought I'd start with a why. Why did I have to write this book? Because this is a story that has been told many times over, a narrative that has been well documented, well described over the years. I would only say that mine is the account of a diplomat practitioner. And although the story has been told many times, I think the way I've told it perhaps is a little different. I've told it almost in what in our country we call the katha fashion. You know, brought out the characters, brought out the situations, brought out the context, as Ambassador Kanta mentioned. It's a story of the human and policy factors involved, a history with human characteristics, a set of moving pictures, really. And it in a way expresses my personal border crossings. We talk of the border between India and China, but this, in a sense, is also an account of my personal border crossings between a practitioner's world and the world of the historian. I'm not a trained historian by profession, but I did have access to a lot of archival material while writing this book. So I did make that crossing into a world quite different from that of the practitioner. I wrote this story, I wrote this history because what happened in that period between 1949 and 1962 continues to influence our thinking to the present day and our policy formulation in the field of India-China relations. And I wanted a young demographic in India particularly to understand and to use reason and imagination in approaching this topic. And finally, this is a story that cuts across the map. The map defines in many ways our approach to all the problems that have been mentioned in this story, but this is a story that cuts across the map also. Ambassador Kanta mentioned the role of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, our first Prime Minister. Now, my history doesn't make any simplistic deductions about what Nehru did wrong, or why things did not shape up the way people thought they would. I have not apportioned blame in this story to any side, really, because I sincerely believe that the hindsight that we possess now can never be 20/20. And I also am a firm believer of the fact that partial hindsight, like nationalism, is an unsafe historian. The so-called follies of Pandit Nehru, Prime Minister Nehru, cannot be a textbook gospel, in my view. He was flawed, no doubt. He made flawed decisions. But in my view, maybe I grew up in that era, I feel he's flawed in a heroic sense. He's not a godlike figure. He never wanted to be considered that. He did not favor personality cults. But you have to understand the type of man he was, the nature of his contribution to nation building, and the situation in which India was placed in that period. So history, in my view, has a complex warp and a weft, and it has to be understood holistically if we are to appreciate the nature of the problem. Now, as far as China was concerned, Nehru wanted China to be an independent force in world politics, and bringing China onto the world stage so that it would be a responsible stakeholder in world politics. It was a lofty aspiration, not adequately reciprocated. The establishment of the People's Republic of China for him was a world event of first magnitude. He envisioned a partnership of civilizations between India and China. He has been faulted, for one, on his early recognition of the PRC. But I think he saw the reality of the coming to power of the communists after their victory over the Kuomintang. And recognition, whether immediate or delayed, in my view, was inevitable. I think also, as I said earlier, we have to understand the circumstances in which these decisions were made. Decisions are made in real time, and we can't set a clock for Nehru in this regard. I think under Nehru's leadership, what came out also was a clear Indian determination to safeguard borders and territories, which was entrenched from the beginning of this period. But I do concede that Nehru was no strategist. He was not a Bismarck. He was no Kissinger. He decided very often by inspiration and did not really get to the bottom of the frontier problems dividing India and China. But subconsciously, it's also remarkable that he did understand that the basic challenge between India and China ran across the spine of Asia, really. And he did worry about Chinese expansionism. He worried about China taking the upper hand, and the slippery path, as he called it, which he felt could ensue for India as a result. He had a premonition, perhaps, of all these things, some kind of telepathy, but it didn't work out very well either for him or for India. I think coming to the question of Tibet, he should have understood what Dawa Norbu once called the centrality of marginality and the deep linkage of the Tibetan problem to the question of our northern boundaries. And yet, mind you, despite all that, the Tibetan people regarded him as their Dharma Raja, recognizing in him moral qualities that merited such a recognition. And of course, he never hesitated to grant asylum to His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, in India. How did the Chinese consider Nehru? It comes through in my study that they considered him an anachronism in some ways, and knew India as a halfway house at best. India was useful to China as a country that would remain neutral in any conflict. And they very grudgingly conceded occasionally that it could be an agency for good in world affairs. Now, Nehru was the first person to own the failure of his China policy. And while we can fault his judgment of Chinese motives, but we cannot question his own sincerity and his approach to this whole subject. And faulty also was his assumption that China would never turn differences over India, with India over the border into a military conflict. And that I have, covered in some of the final chapters of the book. I don't believe also that Nehru was personally predisposed to adopting a rigid position of negotiating a border settlement with China, because he sensed, especially as far as the Western sector was concerned, in the early part of the problem, or the early part of this history, he sensed the indeterminate nature of the history of the Aksai Chin Plateau and the frontiers of Ladakh with Xinjiang particularly. Now, how do you express the factors that influenced our approach to this problem with China? I think there was this whole feeling, I think Manjari Chatterjee Miller brings it out in her book, and I have drawn reference to it, that there was this sense of victimhood, of having been victims of imperialism, shared by both India and China in their approach to the issue. But I think if you are really to consider who became the real victim of imperialism, I think India really, the pointer must be in India's direction, because I believe all the steps and missteps the British took before independence when it came to border issues, I think we had to pay, we had to settle the account for that after we got independence. Another scholar, Mahesh Shankar, speaks about the reputational imperative for India, and that Nehru was compelled to safeguard his position on the border because he did not wish to succumb to larger powers, in this case China, or compromise sovereignty and territorial integrity. What is clear is that we saw our borders as sacrosanct, although China at that stage seemed willing to approach the problem from the point of view that it needed negotiation. Briefly on Tibet, once again, I think where India was concerned, and I mentioned Tibet in my book because I think it merits that reference. There is a distinct civilizational identity that Tibet has possessed through the ages, and there are complex ties, geography, including sacred geography and religion, pilgrimage, trade, and cultural osmosis that link Tibet and India. And therefore, in that sense, the India-China relationship is a three-body problem. And also, one must consider that in the Himalayas, cultural boundaries transcend political boundaries. They literally overflow linguistically, culturally, ethnographically, no matter how much you divide them by various lines. Now, the dissociation of Tibet from the issue of India's frontiers with Xinjiang and Tibet, once the Chinese entered Tibet, did not yield any tangible benefit for India, although we made vociferous protests when China entered Tibet in 1950 and said the issue should be settled by peaceful negotiations. The Chinese were not pleased, of course. But Nehru was less inclined to focus on Tibet's status as distinct from China's, and more on the need to adjust relations between India and China in order to resolve unsettled conditions in the border areas. His view was that it was impossible to do anything on Tibet, that it was a lost cause, that focusing on friendship with China could help the Tibetan people. But the frontier, in his view, had to be secured. Nothing could be surrendered to China. And the renunciation of India's historic rights in Tibet was done in favor of a strong and nationalistic China in 1954, and not in favor of a weak and friendly Tibet. My book also brings out the role of individuals like Ambassador K.M. Panikkar, who felt that beyond trade rights and a recognized boundary, India's interests in Tibet were but shadowy. He was against taking up the Tibet issue in the UN when officials like Harishwar Dayal, one of the heroes of our story, the political officer in Sikkim, disagreed with this, saying that the government of India had not acknowledged Chinese suzerainty over Tibet. My book has one chapter on suzerainty and sovereignty. I had not acknowledged Chinese suzerainty over Tibet since 1911, having direct dealings with Tibet and even refusing visas to Chinese travelers to Tibet, whose entry was not agreed to by the Tibetan government. A significant point made by Sumul Sinha, another hero of our story, our political officer in Lhasa, was that India's rights and obligations vis-a-vis Tibet, and this is key, absolutely key, were based on the 1914 Simla Convention. The McMahon Line was an offshoot of that conference, and if the convention, Simla Convention, were disregarded, we would expose ourselves to renewed Chinese claims to the Assam tribal area, which is exactly what happened. But the overall consensus also was that maintaining Tibet as a buffer state was unrealistic, and even officials like Secretary General G.S. Bajpai and Foreign Secretary K.P.S. Menon, despite their personal sympathy for the Tibetans, felt that there was nothing much that we could do in the face of the threat posed to India by China's entry and irrevocably damaging relations with China, and a rise in aggressive threats by China to the border areas at a time when our administration was still being consolidated along India's borders, especially along the McMahon Line, would not work in our interest. And we would be inviting confrontation with China. Therefore, such confrontation could never be a solution. Nehru, of course, felt there was no territorial dispute or controversy. It was an error, no dispute with China. The Chinese silence on border issues was construed as meaning their consent to the border as seen by India. Another critical error in the strategic direction, in the higher direction of leadership. China was, I think, aware of our approach to this. And it felt, and this is where the Chinese characteristics come out. They felt that this was where the plot of India lies. I don't think it was so much of a plot. I think as much as an error of omission by China, claiming the absence of territorial disputes. China felt, as the archives tell us, was just to force us to implicitly, that is, force China to implicitly acknowledging and legitimizing India's occupation of disputed areas. Anyway, I feel, and I've said that in my narrative, that India, while negotiating the trade agreement with China on Tibet in 1954, should have sought a bilateral agreement with China on the border. The Chinese would in all likelihood have said they were not ready to discuss it. But an opening gambit would at least have been made, and we would have thus been able to understand the full nature that an unsettled boundary with China posed to us. I don't think guesswork is good diplomacy. I think we were just kind of, second guessing the Chinese, and it turned out to be quite wrong on our part. And on that basis, to assume that the stage was clear, as Nehru did, to issue instructions to the map-making authorities, to the Survey of India, to show India's northern boundaries as fixed and determined, where hitherto they had been shown in sections as undefined, was effectively to shut the door on any joint settlement of the border with China. There is, of course, this whole controversy of Jawaharlal Nehru versus Sardar Patel on their respective approaches to China. I don't believe Sardar Patel's views on China should be faulted. We should not. But we don't have the benefit of knowing what his actual policy dealings with China would have been if he had lived long enough. All that is in the realm of speculation, because he also, as Nehru had to, would have had to grapple with the realities of the situation and the military strength of China in Tibet. Essentially, my question is, what was the load-bearing capacity of the young republic, our republic, at that point in history, to embark on a policy of what could well have turned out to be a prolonged confrontation with China? So solutions to this whole problem may not be found in our history. I think the scholar Kyle Gardner said recently in his wonderful book, The Frontier Complex, that borders have been objectified. And somehow the watershed in the Himalayas has become a kind of Gordian knot, as Berenice Richard also says in her excellent study. The British were looking for water partings as boundary lines. They're not easy to locate in the Aksai Chin. Until independence, some ambiguity was tolerated as far as borders were concerned. After independence, that became more and more difficult. So there are numerous, physical and human landscapes to be understood and also frontiers of the mind, as it were. I know that we will probably be discussing other recent books, especially that talk about Nehru having badly handled relations with China, about his policy being riddled with contradictions. I think that can form the part of our discussion. But let me dwell just briefly before I end on the whole scenario confronting India after partition. The division of our country had left us deprived of the traditional mountain walls that protected us, as we saw our definition of the geobody of India. The control of Tibet by China had brought us into contact with a suspicious neighbor. The feeling in policymaking circles in South Bloc and North Bloc was that the surrounding seas were empty with the exit of British power, and the countries on India's flank were weak, which meant that any strong power thrusting down from the north could isolate us. Now, peninsular India is basically a peninsula, has a land frontier even more extensive than its seaboard. The substitution of China for Tibet as a neighbor left us with no option but to focus on border claims and many other undecided questions. The frontier with China, mind you, at that time of independence, was recognized as disputed. Chinese maps were showing the boundary differently. If Chinese claims were realized, that would have brought China into the upper Assam Valley from both the north and the east. And it was understood that relations between China and Tibet could not be viewed with disinterested detachment by India, since they directly concerned our northeast frontier. So the focus really was on the northeast frontier, and all that followed, the steps that were taken to consolidate our administration in the early 50s. But, there is also this whole question, and maybe I'm not putting it as diplomatically as I should, of British perfidy. After the 1914 Simla Conference, British India did little to make China recognize the eastern frontiers of Tibet with China, and this made the Tibetans feel that they gave up something for nothing in agreeing to the McMahon Line. And after independence, the government of India recognized that a defensible frontier was a matter of vital importance to this country. And what could be the most desirable military and political frontier? That really was the problem, the dilemma facing us. I will not dwell too much on the future of our relations with China, except to say that they are not in a good place today. And the fragility of our relationship is constantly exposed. It points to persistent and underlying regional rivalries, memories of past conflict, hostile public opinion, low levels of political equilibrium in seeking creative and peaceful solutions. And I use the word creative with peaceful because we do need that. We need that approach if we are to solve this problem. But then China's attitude today, its assertiveness, its I would say even manifestations of hubris do not really augur any optimism as far as looking at a solution to this problem is concerned. Nationalistic instincts and tendencies are there in both countries. The strategic dilemma posed by Tibet in relations between India and China remain far from resolved. There is an asymmetry of power between India and China. And, as the academic concept, I hear this constantly being bandied, asymmetric negotiations, flowing from that asymmetry of power, asymmetric negotiations also between our two countries. And the presence of the 14th Dalai Lama, His Holiness here, is regarded by many scholars, Western scholars particularly, as a leverage that India possesses. The same scholars seem to hold the opinion that our case, as far as the boundary is concerned, may not be as strong as we think it is, and therefore, the situation is quite complicated. I think I should stop here. We are in a year when we will be observing the 60th anniversary of our conflict with China. It's easy to play winners and losers as far as that conflict was concerned. Perhaps the dust has settled better. Now China withdrew from territories overrun south of the McMahon Line, but it has consolidated its position in Ladakh, and it continues to. There are obvious manifestations of further Chinese ingress into on our side of the line of actual control, which has generated all the current tensions flowing from the Galwan tragedy of June 2020. So let me stop here because I think I've spoken enough. I hope I have not exceeded the time, but thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nirupama, for that very fascinating, account of why you wrote the book, bringing out some of the key salient themes you have pursued in the book. As you said, your book is a story with many actors. You have brought out the context of momentous developments taking place between 1949 and 1962. It's a book so rich in both facts and analysis that we perhaps need a day-long seminar to do full justice to it. I fully agree with you that solutions to the problems we have with China will not be found in history, but at the same time, it's very important to understand history because there are important pointers and lessons and takeaways from history which remain relevant today. Thanks for that. We'll come back to themes you have raised later during Q&A session. I will now turn to Anand Krishnan, Hong Kong-based China correspondent, Hindu. You are all familiar with with Anand, his writings. He is one of the most, I think, well-informed Indian journalists on China. And recently he published a remarkable book on India-China engagement called India's China Challenge. So Anand, we'll turn to you for your comments on the book.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Kanta and ICS. And to begin with, I should begin by saying it's a great honor to be here today and to speak about Ambassador Rao's new book. And it's an honor for many reasons for me. When I first moved to Beijing in 2009, at that point of time as a reporter for The Hindu who knew next to nothing about China, I was really fortunate that Ambassador Rao was there then. And I think starting then and in the many years since, I've been quite fortunate to, I think, glean so many insights from her on China and on the relationship in particular. And I think for me, this book, what is really valuable, I think, whether it's for a journalist such as myself who's reporting on the relationship as it is today, or whether it's to students or even to current or aspiring diplomats, or anyone actually who has an interest in the relationship of these two countries and their future. It's not only a work of such deep historical research that draws on archives and archival material, but as Ambassador Kanta said as well, it's told in a really engaging way as a story. And I think what also really comes out is the context and experience of a practitioner who's been dealing with China for so many years, going back to the China desk at the NEA in the 1980s and 90s, and of course to Ambassador in Beijing. And I think that's something that you really won't find in many other works of history of this period is from someone who was actually involved in building the relationship. And I think in that sense, it's a truly unique work that goes beyond history and is sprinkled with a lot of insights that make sense for us why this history matters and how it continues to impact the relationship today. So even if, as the title says, the focus is on those crucial 13 years, it is about much more than that. And I think it tells us not only why this period is important, but why we should understand it and embrace the complexity and nuance, and not, the sense of black and white 140 character summaries that are the fashion of the moment in deciding who is to blame and what happened. And I think that there's one conclusion that we can draw as the author writes, is that there really aren't easy explanations for why things went wrong. And in that sense, for me, this book in its embrace of complexity is very much an antidote to this current fashion of, if I can call it, a WhatsAppization of history, of politicizing it, that seems to have taken over in India and everywhere else as well. So what I'll do in the next few minutes, it's a 600-page book. So as Ambassador Kanta said, you need a day to really reflect on it. but I'll make 4 brief observations on some of the takeaways that really stood out for me. And what is common to all of them is that they have a particular relevance to the state of the relationship today, which a lot of us are obviously looking at and concerned about. But firstly, I should begin with Nehru, who is in many ways, as has been said both in Ambassador Kanta's introduction and in Ambassador Rao's remarks, that he is the central character of this book, and obviously of this period in the relationship as well, perhaps along with Mao and Zhou Enlai. And I think the author describes him, quote, as the prime accused. And I think the book is quite unsparing in its criticisms of Nehru, and rightly so. And I think it's entirely justified in pointing out how wrong he was in many of his assumptions about China. But I think what stands out in this narrative is it's an attempt to understand the circumstances in which he made many of his decisions. And as Ambassador Rao said, hindsight is easy. Hindsight is 2020. It takes no great effort to see where things went wrong. But understanding those decisions is less easy. And I would argue that's so much more important if we do not want to see those mistakes being repeated. And I think contrary to the now ingrained popular perception of that period, it's very clear in this book that, which Ambassador Rao alluded to, that Nehru was by no means rosy-eyed about China at all, although that perception is so pervasive today. And this book actually documents with evidence his own deep misgivings about China's intentions, as well as China's ambitions in Asia, and he articulates that very directly and clearly. It also brings out his very hard stand on the border and a refusal to negotiate, which of course would have enormous costs. And I'll come back to that point. But then on the other side of that, you also had to what seems to us today, this very unfathomable belief of the need to have this, the civilizational understanding between India and China. It might seem unfathomable to us today, but again, I think the book gives us a sense of the context of the aftermath of independence and the broader decolonization movement, and the strong desire that Nehru had to see India, despite all of its many problems, to punch above its weight on world affairs. And you can argue that under him, India certainly did. But then the problem with this sort of missionary-like zeal that he had about notions of pan-Asian solidarity was that in many ways wasn't very interested in what China wanted and what Chinese intentions were. And that kind of brings me to the second point that I'll spend most time on, and I think which is relevant to us today, which is of Chinese intentions. I think this notion of a, quote, betrayal of China stabbing India on the back is so pervasive and something that Nehru perhaps encouraged to some degree. And maybe perhaps he no doubt believed that as well. But then that was also born out of a refusal to see what was, as the book shows us, lots of evidence that contradicted many of the assumptions he made about Chinese thinking and Chinese decision-making. And it was not that he was unaware about China's ambitions or expansionism. And the book brings out examples of times when he specifically expresses concerns about it. Yet, for him, it was never as big a concern as his wish to, see China, to borrow from today's language, as a responsible stakeholder in Asia and in the world. And to me, it really sort of resonated with the fact that he's hardly alone in this mistake. Time and again, decades later, you only need to look at what the US did in the way that it sort of welcomed China into the global economy while somehow having its own expectations and beliefs that this would lead China to democratize, which turned out to be completely wrong. And as far as India was concerned, it was by no means the case that Delhi was unaware of China's intentions, especially to the border. The book is full of illuminating examples drawn from archives, drawn from research of the cautionary notes sounded by many Indian officials. And to me, that was one of the most striking elements of this book. And the takeaway from all of them was, to put it very simply, that China had a very different view about India than what Nehru had about China. That was something that was completely lost. And I think that's one point that I think it's worth for us to reflect here today. This idea of pan-Asian solidarity was certainly the view of some Chinese intellectuals. But that was one strand of thought. There was another strand as well. An idea of India, of an India that was by no means an equal to China, of an India that was an example to China of weakness, of a country that had lost its, of a civilization that had lost its way, of an India that was a stooge to the West. The image of Indians who policed the streets of Shanghai was something that was, became so deeply ingrained and remains deeply ingrained. And as Mao articulated it, of an India that wanted to inherit imperial ambitions of the British. But yet this idea of Asian civilization and solidarity is still persisted. And this book really pushes us to reflect on why that is so. It was later reborn as an idea of an Asian century that more recently India and China, both governments signed on to, perhaps without ever agreeing or talking through what it meant to have an Asian century. And what it meant that both India and China have very different visions of Asian security and Asia's future. To bring it to current events, only last week, you had Xi Jinping in Boao articulating a vision of pan-Asian unity yet again, as he laid out this vision of a global security initiative of Asian countries handling their own affairs. Yet, what is the power dynamic within that notion of Asian security, and where does China see itself in it? That's something that's never spelled out. And more recently, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you had no shortage of commentaries again coming back to that idea after Wang Yi's visit. And why this persists is really worth exploration. And whether it's just a reflex of anti-Western sentiment that sort of ends up being directed at some imagined notion of Asian solidarity. This isn't to say it's impossible, but this book, what this book does is tells us it's dangerous to assume that the other side wants the same as what you do, as well as to assume that both of you have the same intentions. A third point that I think really comes out is the importance of, I think, democratic decision-making. One quote of the book that really stood out for me is one of Nehru's close advisors would reflect that, you had this whole body of professional civil servants who did not exert themselves to, express dissent on serious issues, which would end up having such grave consequences. And it's put really strikingly that they quote, there was a general surrender to the hypnosis that Panditji knows best. That was an extensive phenomenon within the government and within the bureaucracy. And I think that without saying too much more on this, this has great relevance today and will always have. And the 50s and the 60s are a grave example of what happens when you have a sense of groupthink. And, and not only in foreign policy, but when it comes to domestic policy as well. And fourthly, one final lesson from this book, I think when we look back, it's important to see what's changed. I think the argument of this book is by no means that 1962 will be repeated or that India of today is the same as India of 1962. That's made very clear. But yet it calls on us to reflect on the past and many of the questions that, this 13 years period leaves us with. And one question that I kept coming back to was that why was Nehru so unwilling to negotiate? To us, it seems so clear that, there's a solution staring everyone in the face. And I think as the author writes, this sort of inflexibility was not the result of one thing, it was the result of many things, including the result of opposition within his cabinet, of heated criticism in parliament, a desire from many in the political class to embarrass the government on the China issue, of course, on China's own aggression in 1959 and other instances. Another point that isn't mentioned in the book, I think, which if you go back to see the archives of newspapers of the day, the media as well, in terms of late 1950s and early 1960s, in terms of how it hamstrung, decision-making and the space they had to sort of work out these issues. I think each one of these, all of these are, relevant factors today. And I think will remain relevant factors as we deal with the boundary question going forward. And the book puts it very sort of succinctly where it says diplomacy foundered in a whirlpool of political rhetoric in a public space where reason and foresight were sacrificed. And I think the sort of concluding message is quite powerful, which says that, India still has to extricate itself from these currents. So there's so much more in this book I didn't get into. I didn't even get into Tibet, which is a big chunk of this book. And I think it does a great service, I think, in recentering Tibet as something that for us to think about the India-China equation. But I think I will stop here. And all I'll say is, I think that you should, I don't think it's been held out yet, but I'd say please read it. Please read it for yourself. And I would sort of endorse what Ambassador Kanta said. I think this will become kind of a book that we all go back to and turn to time and again to, I think, make sense of this period in history. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anant. I fully agree with you that Nirupama's book is one we'll go back to again and again. It's a book which is relevant for anyone who's interested in China, whether it's a journalist, a scholar, or a practitioner. Anant brought out 4 key lessons from the book and how they remain relevant to our dealings with China today. And these takeaways are germane not only for India, but anyone who's interested in China. Thanks for those comments. Now I'll use my prerogative, the chair, to have a conversation with Nirupama. In fact, I have a long list of questions I want to discuss, but I know time is limited. So let me limit myself to 2-3 questions. Nirupama, my first question is something Anant also referred to, relevance of learnings of the book for our current dealings with China. The introduction of your book begins with a quote, when the past no longer illuminates the future, the spirit walks in darkness. How do you see our understanding the period 1949-1962 illuminating the future of India-China relations? What are the lessons, takeaways, and pointers emerging out of study which will help us in our dealings with China today? Do you see Indian diplomats, negotiators benefiting from these learnings while handling subsequent events and challenges in India-China relations post-1962?
Ashok, that is a very seminal question, really, that you raised. I think as we approach the problems that define India-China relations today, we are very much influenced by the context of the past. But perhaps because generations have passed and years have gone by, sometimes we neglect to absorb and assimilate and comprehend the nuances involved in how this problem came about, how this history evolved, how it was formed, essentially. So that was the purpose of why I wrote this book, because when you read it and understand how our entire frontier policy was framed in those years, you see how it moves from a situation where we seemed to understand, most policymakers seemed to understand in 1950, 1951, that there was an essential ambiguity about the definition of where the boundaries between India and China lay, because that was the situation we had inherited. And coupled with that, the invasion of Tibet by China, the military, in a sense you can call it conquest by the PLA of Tibet, completely changed. It fractured the Himalaya for us. In fact, one of the reasons that I called the book by this title was because the entire concept of that mountain wall that had defended us for millennia was essentially, as Sumul Sinha put it in his very apocryphal quote that is assigned to him, the Chinese have entered Tibet, the Himalayas no longer exist. But be that as it may, understanding the current context or the problems that we have between India and China, I think must always be, the understanding of that has to commence from a thorough comprehension and understanding of what transpired in our relationship between the two countries, India and China, in those vital 13 years. Essentially, those 13 years formed the universe of India-China relations as we know it today. It comes back, the past continues to come back to haunt us, but we must understand it thoroughly, understand the nuances. And it is not a black and white story, as Anant put it. There are so many aspects of it that we must understand if we are to approach the issue today. But let it be also said that India did not inherit a good deck of cards on this. And I think it has a lot to do with Britain's attitude. And Britain, of course, oscillated between points of time when it said Tibet was a part of China, towards other facets or other aspects when it said that Tibet was autonomous, that autonomy was never defined, to other angles where it said China could not have direct, real direct dealings with Outer Tibet, as Outer Tibet was defined in the Simla Convention. And Britain never took action to consolidate what it had shown as British Indian territory as a result of the Simla Convention of 1914, the Indo-Tibetan Agreement, which predicated where the boundary lay in the northeastern sector, the McMahon line, as we know. But I heard it said the other day in a discussion that Britain drew that line without really any knowledge. But I would like to correct that impression. Britain did undertake surveys of the northeastern frontier, the Assam tribal areas, quite extensively from 1911 to 1913. And it was as a result of discussions within the policy establishment that the McMahon line was drawn on the map. It was not Sir Henry McMahon who sat down with Lonchan Shatra and took a thick-nibbed pen and drew a line across the map. That was certainly not the case. I think that impression should also be corrected.
Thank you, Nirupama. My second question relates to something you alluded to in your opening remarks. Some suggestions recently that the Indian case on India-China boundary question is deeply flawed and untenable, both in eastern sector and western sector. I would like to have your comments. You are partly commenting this issue just now. I would also like to request you to offer a short assessment of the Chinese case on the boundary issue and the evidence they have proffered. How persuasive is that case?
Well,
and I'm asking you both as a negotiator, as a scholar.
Well, my book refers to Olaf Caro's comments on the report of the officials of 1960, the report of the officials' talks. And it speaks, Caro speaks of how the Indian case was presented with the thoroughness of the Oxford cloister, literally, complete in detail and thorough in its research. I'm not, commenting on the rights and wrongs here. And that the Chinese had, very little data, to use a modern word, to present in order to buttress their case, that their case was shot through with sly mockery of India throughout. And I think that, in a sense, encapsulates the Indian and Chinese sort of approaches to this whole border problem through the decades. Now, you referred to what has been said recently about India not having a case in the Western or Eastern sector. I think that is perhaps too simplistic a deduction to make, Ashok. As far as the Western sector of the border is concerned, the frontiers of Ladakh, the Xinjiang, and Tibet, there were numerous efforts that were ongoing in over the last couple of centuries to see where the border would lie in that area. The British made numerous efforts. They made some overtures to China. The Chinese never responded to it. But at the time of independence, what we inherited was a somewhat indeterminate nature of the boundary in this area. And we had a couple of lines to choose from. And we chose the line that was really best for our defense. The theory being, it's better to have inaccessible terrain on your side of the frontier than on the other side of the frontier. So I think in a sense, explains the Western sector. But talking of the Chinese case in the Western sector, it is as indeterminate as what I just said, we encountered on the Indian side. And, possession being 9/10 of the law, that's exactly what the Chinese did in the Western sector. They took advantage of the fact that although we showed the Aksai Chin within our boundaries, had not taken steps to patrol the area frequently, to establish some form of presence there, although the nature of the terrain being what it was, it's a moonscape. So life is hardly sustainable in those areas. But be that as it may, the Chinese very clandestinely built a highway in that area. They must have seen our maps. They must have been aware of where we conceptualized our boundary as lying. But despite that, they built that road. There were occasional reports reaching us, intelligence reports of people on the ground that a highway was being built. But we chose not to really raise the issue with the Chinese until, of course, the news of the launch of the highway became public, which is when, of course, everybody went berserk about this. So to sum up, I mean, in the West, I think to say that India has no case and to assume by that argument that China has a case, I think is entirely a fallacy. When it comes to the eastern sector of the boundary, I refer to the fact that some of these, obiter dicta seem to say that India has no case in the eastern sector. We didn't know anything about the area, that McMahon just sat down and, like Van Gogh drew a red line on the map. No, that was not at all the actual position. Surveys were conducted in the area from 1911 to 1913. Why did we do that? Because we were anxious about Chinese forays into the eastern borders of the Burma-India frontier, the activities of Chow Feng before the Chinese Revolution in 1911. And that had raised the alarm both in Delhi and London, and it was felt that our tribal areas should be secured, that we should have a militarily defensible boundary with the Chinese, because we didn't want them threatening the valley of the Brahmaputra Valley and all the assets and resources that we had in the region. So there was a definite reason why we sought an agreement with Tibet as far as the eastern frontier was concerned in 1914. I think the mistake that the British made, as I referred to it, was not to consolidate Indian presence in the areas south of the McMahon Line before independence. Various reasons are attributed to that, some being that they wanted to get the Chinese on board to sign the tripartite Simla Convention of 1914, which the Chinese refused to consistently. And also, the British not being able at that time to devote sufficient resources to completing these tasks. But be that as it may, I think it was a case of bureaucratic inaction. It just was not under consideration, not in focus, not given the urgency it discovered. And that, coupled with this kind of on again, off again efforts by Britain to seek Tibetan recognition of the McMahon Line, the offer to readjust the boundary south of Tawang, which was made a couple of times from 1944 onwards, first by Basil Gould, then by A.J. Hopkinson, and then after independence in 1948 by India, actually. But all this was on the assumption that if the border was to be adjusted south of Tawang, it was on the clear condition that the Tibetans should accept the McMahon Line and that the offer could not be indefinite or left open for them to come back anytime they wanted. Be that as it may, the Tibetans never responded to it. And once the Chinese entered Tibet, of course, the situation changed completely, and we were completely in our rights, I think, to take a decision to occupy Tawang, to extend administration into Tawang in February of 1951, and to draw and to complete what the British had not done. So in that, and then, for the British, having, sort of conceptualized the McMahon Line, having conceptualized the rights and privileges that India had in Tibet, the kind of boundary we should have, and kept alive this talk of Chinese suzerainty, recognition of Chinese suzerainty subject to China accepting Tibet's autonomy. All that came asunder in 2008 when David Miliband announced that the concept of suzerainty was being dropped, it was anachronistic, and Chinese sovereignty over Tibet was recognized. So essentially, Britain really junked the Simla Agreement in 2008, as some put it.
Thank you, Nirupama, for setting the record straight on a whole lot of issues which have been debated recently. While we wait for more questions to come up in the chat box, and I'm requesting colleagues also to raise their hand if they wish to ask question. I see Ambassador Nambiar has raised his hand. I'll just come to him. I have one last question, Nirupama. This is something you have covered quite extensively in the book, the so-called forward policy, which you rightly describe as a misnomer. I suppose more a policy of surveillance rather than one of trying to make the Chinese vacate their intrusions in Western and Eastern sector. But there are scholars who have suggested that this policy triggered the 1962 conflict. I would request your views on the antecedents, nature, and consequences of the forward policy.
Yeah. Well, Ashok, I think the entire military conflict in 1962 has a lot to do with the situation that evolved in the Western sector post-China's construction of the Aksai-Chin Highway, its steady advance westward, west of the highway, into territory that was considered Indian, and the occupation of such territory and the construction of various Chinese posts along this line. The whole Konka Pass incident of October 9 of 1959 started and ended like that, and in a sense was a turning point in the history of this entire of our relationship with China, almost like Galwan. And this whole episode of what happened at the Konka Pass, in a sense, triggered the steps that we took to enforce a policy of surveillance. The words are K. Subramanian's, actually. He said we don't call it forward policy. Really, it was a policy of sustained surveillance that we tried to enforce in those areas where there seemed to be a steady Chinese ingress westward, and where the whole position of a city like Leh, for instance, was threatened. The whole axis of the Shiok-Indus sections of the boundary leading up to the Karakoram Pass, leading up to the line of control with Pakistan at that time called the ceasefire line. All this was threatened. So to say that the forward policy, as some scholars like Neville Maxwell, I think, put it, was to somehow throw the Chinese out to threaten the Aksai-Chin Highway. That's not true. I think what A.J. Noorani said at one point, while contradicting Maxwell, is true, and I mentioned it in my book, was we set up those posts, what we call those forward posts, in order to prevent further Chinese ingress. And those posts were so poorly planned. They were really penny packets. They were not capable of fighting really any battle with the Chinese. But it obviously did not take very much to provoke the Chinese, who were already quite at loggerheads with India following the Tibet revolt, the flight of the Dalai Lama to India, the whole manner in which the situation in the border areas had deteriorated. The Chinese themselves were going through considerable internal turmoil. And all these factors, I think, contributed to China's decision to take military action against us. Something, I think, where we were terribly flawed in assuming that there would be no military reactions from China. We didn't ever assume that there could be military conflict between India and China. In essence, we were unprepared for it.
And that was a serious error of judgment,
Yes.
presuming that there'll be no military conflict. Nirupama, there are a lot of questions in the chat box. Before we come to those questions, I'll invite Ambassador Vijay Nambiar to ask his question.
Nirupama, let me congratulate you on your presentation today, both of you, and I think Anand have been very, very articulate, and I think you brought some of the very, very interesting ideas. About your book, what can I say? I think, as I've mentioned in the blurb itself, it is the definitive study, actually, as it stands now. It would be the go-to book for anybody who wants to know anything about those particular years. And apart from being erudite, I think it presents such multi-textured kind of impressions. I think it's a treat to read. Every time I've read it, at least I've tried to read it more than once, at 2 sections of it. But about lessons that you've mentioned, I was just wanting to check with you on 1 or 2 things. Obviously, we've learned a major lesson that silence on the Chinese part is not acquiescence. That is clearly the kind of thing which successively we've learned. And second is that, shirking of unpleasantness, what Gopal talked about in his reference to Panikkar. Panikkar, in a sense, influenced Nehru a lot. And there was a sense people had that perhaps Panikkar didn't want to raise unpleasant questions with the Chinese in those days, partly because of the kind of mindset which Nehru had regarding the place of China, this civilizational understanding, this kind of thing he had with the need to get. And Nehru, as well as Krishna Menon and others, had actually been playing major roles, as it were, in trying to move China away from the kind of isolation it had, which I think Nehru felt very strongly could, in this nuclear kind of this bloc relations, the bitterness that there was between the 2 blocs, could actually lead to outbreak of war, and it did in Korea. But at the same time, I think in doing this, taking silence as acquiescence and not wanting to, the shirking of unpleasantness resulted in in terms of our not wanting to, apparently the argument given was that Panikkar didn't want to raise the questions with China because it would mean negotiating a fresh boundary, and that would not be advantageous to us. I don't know how we could then move to this position of actually identifying everything as settled from our point of view. That gave the Indian government, not so much vis-a-vis China, but vis-a-vis our own people, it actually gave a totally wrong impression. In fact, it forced the opposition to the people of India that our borders were absolutely well demarcated and there was no question of our yielding. And that was what caused the major problem. If there was a willingness to accept some kind of a need to discuss, which Girija Shankar and others had talked about, and if it did, of course, involve raising the question of negotiating a fresh boundary, that would have even informed the Indian people as a whole that the boundary was not actually all tied, in a sense, delineated and decided and distinct from our point of view. And I think that initial mistake has come all the way down to us. And even today, we are facing the problem of any kind of discussion on even a line of actual control. If there is any need for clarification, there is this total fixity in terms of a total absence of complete rigidity, and that has actually been at the base of all our difficulties with China. I don't know what you have in terms how you would comment on that. The second point which you said was this question of how well prepared we were in 1960 in our discussions with the Chinese, and how diffident, perhaps even evasive, the Chinese were. You said that they were almost a little, derisive but the interesting thing which you mentioned, and I like that, was probably the best quotation from your book, is Olaf Caro's comment on the discussions, on the which I think you mentioned in your introduction to piling Pelion on Osa and Osa on Olympus. There was so much of detail, but I'm not sure whether all our details were actually accurate. In fact, some of the coordinates we gave were totally wrong. And so to say that, we had been very sort of meticulous is probably, we were meticulous in points of argumentation in terms of bringing arguments and bringing sources, but our own ideas of where these points lie were quite vague, I think. And we gave very detailed points, which subsequently were proved to be wrong. What is your impression on that, Nirupama?
Yeah, I completely agree with you, sir, that we were being the argumentative Indians, I think, in those talks with China. And, although, I respect Dr. Gopal as a historian, but he was charged with bringing back the evidence from his study of the British archives and structuring our case accordingly. And what he had to say then became the gospel as far as our, presenting our case to the Chinese was concerned. And I think the true post-mortem of that is yet to be written, I think, which is another reason I believe so strongly that we should open our archives now to the people of India on this subject. Because so much has been written now. At the time we were dealing with this subject 30 years ago, nothing was known about the subject, and what all we are writing about today was all locked up in the cupboards, in the various registries of the Ministry of External Affairs. Today, it's so much is there in the open, so there's little point in keeping these archives shut. We must educate people about the nature of our case, about the ambiguities present, about the gray areas, about the holes in our case, I believe. So in that sense, I completely agree to say that, we were, of course, we thought we had prepared meticulously, that we were thorough, that our case was watertight. I think in that sense, the 1960 talks represent a case of Indian hubris also. So as much as the 1960 talks between Zhou Enlai and Nehru also represent another case of Indian hubris, because the way the ministers responded to responded to Zhou Enlai, responded to Chen Yi. I know that Zhou Enlai was no angel, and he was no archangel, and he was cunning, he was tenacious, he was, completely battle-hardened communist veteran.
Something that he was devious too, in terms of, you mentioned this thing about
cunning and tenacious. In fact, I'd like to read from that section of my book where Zhou Enlai is referred to as a man of cunning, of tenacity, of charm. And, somebody like Kissinger was so adulatory about him. He could just sort of charm people and delude people into thinking everything that he was not. He had the deft talent for finding a tiny crack in the wall that would allow him to appear even-keeled. He was unique in his capacity to endure abasement, an enabler of Mao with a servant mentality. He could stick a knife in your back and do it with such disarming grace that you would still feel compelled to thank him for the deed. So it's not that, Zhou Enlai was any angel.
I think you must recall also his talks in '54, was it, with Kaul against Timaya trying in the Korean War. That was straightforward. Exactly.
The Chinese had their knife into Timaya just because I think he saw through a lot of what they were doing during the war and the treatment of Chinese prisoners and the repatriation of Chinese prisoners, on which Zhou Enlai was aggressive, bordering on threatening towards India, I think. So I hope I've answered your question, sir, but I completely agree with what you said. And I think that people need to be educated in this country about the nature of the case on our border with China. Not that we have no case, but I think the fundamental principle is that we need to approach this from the angle that this border was not mutually decided at any point in its entirety between India and China. And to have a settled border, India and China need to get down to negotiation, and that negotiation will have to involve some give and take between the two countries.
Nirupama, we have a lot of questions in chat box, and we are running out of time. So what I'll do, I'll sort of club some of the questions together. There's a question from Apurv Raj on YouTube channel. We are also live casting it on YouTube. Question is whether between the period 1949-62, did India try to build relationship with Chinese nationalists in Kuomintang or Hong Kong colonial administration? And was any change in this policy after 1962 border conflict? That's one. Second question is from Master Pinakaranjan Chakravarti, and it's a sort of hypothetical scenario. If we had not taken a position on Tibet and refused to recognize China's occupation and called it illegitimate, if we had derived more leverage. Third question is from Dr. Rup Narayan Das. He's inquiring whether you consulted debates in Parliament as part of your research. Let's start with these three questions first.
Well, on Taiwan, dealing with the nationalists and dealings with Taiwan and with the administration in Hong Kong in the years 1949 to 1962, I think you have to look at it in different compartments. With Taiwan, with the nationalists, not so much. Nehru writing to Vijayalakshmi Pandit when the communists entered Beijing in 1949 was of the view that the nationalists were a corrupt government that had thoroughly discredited themselves. A lot of the official establishment in India also felt that at that time. And the nationalists in the Kuomintang were as self-centered about how they regarded China vis-a-vis India. I think there were the same approaches about Chinese superiority, about Chinese greatness, about Chinese exceptionalism and Chinese singularity that the nationalists and the communists possessed. They were Chinese, basically being Chinese. So we didn't have too many dealings really with Taiwan in that period. Or for that matter, really after 62, to the best of my knowledge. But with Hong Kong, with the colonial, of course, we dealt with Hong Kong much more than we dealt with Taiwan. And it was from Hong Kong that the ill-fated flight of the Kashmir Princess, the Air India Constellation plane, took off on the eve of the Bandung conference. It crashed in the Sea of Indonesia, as you know, carrying a lot of Chinese journalists. Zhou Enlai was supposed to travel on that flight. And today, a lot of the research would indicate that sabotage took place as a result of Taiwanese intelligence, and questions have been raised about it. I'm not saying we've come to any complete conclusions, but there is a trail. If we had not recognized Tibet, would we have derived leverage? I think Tibet really became the Cinderella of our story in many ways, abandoned on all sides by the Indians, by the British, by the Americans, by the United Nations. And would it have been different if we had opposed the Chinese entry into Tibet and refused to recognize Chinese sovereignty over Tibet? Of course, things would have been different. The question of Tibet would have remained on the agenda. But as I said, hindsight can never be 20/20. But I really feel that Tibet was abandoned to history. Again, as to use the word, it became the Cinderella of our Foreign Office. It became the Cinderella of many, many foreign offices, and I don't believe it's been rescued. as yet. If we had taken the Chinese on, as far as Tibet is concerned, I think we should have been prepared for a relationship of complete confrontation with China from the beginning. Not that the Chinese could have done very much on our frontiers, but maybe we would have been better prepared. But I don't believe the question of Tibet could have been solved to the satisfaction of the Tibetans, unfortunately, even if we had done that, because I don't believe we were prepared to take on the Chinese militarily on this at any point of time. As far as consulting the debates in Parliament, yes, I did consult the published parliamentary debates on the issue of China in the period leading up to the war.
Okay, we have several questions. I'll again, club some of them together. There's a question from Chandralok Kumar. He wants to know what was Pandit Nehru's position on raising the Tibet issue in the UN. Then Mr. James Chow, he's asking, as fellow Asians in a geopolitically complex region, how best do you think we can come together as people in the 21st century of emerging in unfamiliar challenges, not only as Indians and Chinese, but inclusively of other nations in our important region? Question from Onkar Bhole. He's inquiring to what extent domestic conditions within China contributed to Chinese actions in 1962. And finally, from Colonel K.K. Venkatraman, he wants to know, are there any inputs on how the decision to change the boundary in Aksai chain from unmarked to international boundary, a demarcated international boundary, was taken in 1954? Okay, there's one more actually from Anand Sahai. He's complimenting Nirupama, Anant, and Ambassador Nambiar. I think it's in the nature of comment, so it's fine. And thanks, Anant, for those comments. Yeah, Nirupama, can we get back to you?
So Nehru's attitude on raising Tibet in the United Nations, I mentioned that in my opening remarks, that as far as Tibet was concerned, Nehru really felt there was that Tibet's case was a lost one, and he didn't really feel taking up the issue of Tibet in the United Nations would serve any purpose. It would only complicate the situation further, that we should be talking to the Chinese, advocating more dialogue between China and Tibet, which brings me to an issue that I didn't bring up in the discussion. I think one question that should occupy our policymakers today, if you proceed on the assumption that we have a leverage as far as Tibet is concerned, because of the presence of the Tibetan community here and the presence of His Holiness. How do we utilize that, at least to be less hesitant and less, shall we say, we've been almost timid about advocating dialogue between China and the exiled Tibetan community on the issue of some kind of reconciliation between the two sides. It's most necessary, I think, to keep this problem festering like this doesn't help anybody. So that should become, I think, very much a part of our policy approach. I don't believe that is really being considered, but I'm hoping against hope that there will be some consideration of this. But Nehru didn't really want to raise Tibet in the UN. Nehru didn't feel that Tibet could be a buffer between India and China. That essentially, we should promote more dialogue between China and the Tibetans. As far as my friend James Chaw's question, how do we promote a more inclusive coming together of the Asian nations? I think that is everybody's dream. I think the cultivation of an Asian identity, a pluralistic identity that respects diversity, that is able to manage pluralism, that is able to respect the international rule of law. There are question marks raised about China's attitude and its whole approach to a peaceful and orderly situation in the Indo-Pacific, his whole approach to territorial disputes today has created several degrees of dissonance as far as the situation is concerned. As far as the domestic conditions in China contributing to what happened in military action in 1962, I did mention that, and several people have written about it. These are the years leading up to the Cultural Revolution, great turmoil within the country, a sort of power struggle going on. Mao himself feeling his position was threatened, trying to consolidate, trying to fight back, and of course, horrendous conditions being suffered by the Chinese people, and starvation, famine, internal power struggles, a great time of upheaval within the country. As far as changing the boundary from undefined to determined, what contributed to that decision? Now, as I said, the archives have to be opened for that. What we know from the Nehru papers at Timurti was that after the 1954 agreement was signed between India and China, the trade agreement, the Panchsheel agreement, essentially on trade and defining what India's presence in Tibet would be. After that had been signed, and the report of the officer of the historical division who was part of the delegation, Mr. Gopalachari, the report reached Prime Minister Nehru, and he was reading it while holidaying in Mashobra in the Simla Hills in 1954. That's when he took the decision, based on his reading of that report, that we should now show the boundary on our maps as defined and not to be questioned, and that this would be the boundary that India would stand by. He took that decision on the assumption, a very flawed assumption, a critically wrong assumption, that the Chinese would never raise this issue with us, that the boundary was basically settled as a result of the 1954 talks. Why? Because they had not raised it with us. And we know now from our reading of memoirs from the Chinese officials who were involved, and also partially open Chinese archives, which were translated and are still available in the Wilson Center's Cold War project, Cold War History Project, that the Chinese were not prepared to discuss it. They were still studying the records, they were still consolidating the material, they were preparing their case, which is why they had not raised it. The famous phrase of Chou Enlai, we will only raise issues that are ripe for discussion. Obviously, this was not ripe for discussion at that time.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Nirupama. We have really run out of time, but let me conclude by thanking Ambassador Nirupama Rao for a fascinating presentation and for giving such detailed and thoughtful responses to several questions which came today. We have really benefited from what Anand Sahai has put it in chat box, a great conversation. So it has been a really good dialogue today. I would also like to thank Anand Krishnan for making some very insightful remarks on the book, and also for highlighting that India was not alone in misreading China's intentions. He pointed out how USA completely misunderstood China's rise and China's ambitions in recent years. As Ambassador Nirupama Rao rightly pointed out, the solution to our problems with China do not lie in the history. But at the same time, it's very important that we understand history, even though solutions we seek, especially on the boundary question, will have to be political in character, rather than trying to convince each other of the veracity of our respective narratives on the boundary question. I think that's not going to happen. But Nirupama has made a huge contribution by writing this book. And as Ambassador Nambiar said, it's going to be the go-to book for understanding momentous events between 1949 and 1962. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank all of you for participating in this conversation this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.